In this video, we'll take a look at the expansion of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Let's start off by talking about the Greensboro sit-in. In early 1960, African-American college students conducted a sit-in at the restaurant in Woolworth's department store in Greensboro, North Carolina. The sit-in was organized by 4 African-American activists who were students at the North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. They made sure that before the sit-in, they bought items from Woolworths so that they could show that they were paying customers, right? So it was all planned out and organized. The dining area in Woolworths was segregated. So imagine like Walmart, right? It's a department store, but there's also a place where you could eat in there. Like, nowadays you have Walmart and there's a McDonald's in there or whatever, there's a place where you can eat inside of the department store. Well, Woolworths was similar, right? Maybe not as big, but they had a dining area, okay? And so the dining area was segregated. African Americans could not eat at the lunch counter area, right? That space was only for white customers. And so the students, they sat in the lunch counter area and they remained in their seats despite experiencing harassment, okay? They didn't fight back. They used a nonviolent method of protest. And they made sure to notify the media about the protests so that they could bring more exposure to the issue of desegregation and also put pressure on Woolworths and other similar establishments, okay? Additional protests were held in several other locations, and eventually Woolworths did desegregate their lunch counters. This was an example of the many demonstrations that took place throughout the Jim Crow South aimed at ending segregation in various aspects of society. There were a number of different organizations that were involved in these protests, such as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the Congress of Racial Equality, otherwise known as CORE. Another aspect of the civil rights movement was the freedom rides. They involved both white and African American activists who would travel to different parts of the Deep South to continue the push for desegregation on public transit. They'd get on buses and trains and break the custom of segregation. Now, they faced violence from white Southerners and also from the KKK, but their efforts pressured the government to enforce the ruling of the Supreme Court to desegregate public transit. There were also protests to desegregate beaches, and these were known as wade-ins. Okay, so similar to the sit-ins, you have African-American activists who would go to segregated beaches and occupy the space that was typically designated for white residents. Okay, so highlighting and exposing segregation and getting media coverage, okay, putting pressure on the situation, okay. In 1963, a series of protests took place in Birmingham, Alabama. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. took the lead in organizing a protest involving young African-American protesters in a public demonstration. They were sprayed with fire hoses and they were beaten, and the police used attack dogs on them. And all of this was broadcasted on national television, okay? And this led to the international community getting involved, okay? Not just in the United States, okay? So basically they got international sympathy and also support for the civil rights movement, okay? So the Birmingham protests got a lot of attention, brought a lot of attention to the issue, okay? Also in 1963, amidst an environment where hundreds of protests were occurring around the country, A. Philip Randolph organized the massive March on Washington. Okay, 250,000 people, which is a huge protest for that time. So you have a number of speakers who were presenting during the march. Okay, so they went to DC, they stopped, they had a PA system set up, and you had a number of speakers there. So speakers at the march, they were calling for an end to job discrimination through legislation passed by Congress. Okay, so they want to end job discrimination. Also, they're calling for government jobs or public works projects. Okay, so to bring more jobs for African Americans. And also, they're calling for an increase in the minimum wage. Okay, we've got to raise that minimum wage up. It's not a living wage. This is the march where you also have Dr. King giving his famous I Have a Dream speech, okay, where he was calling for racial equality. So the March on Washington was hugely successful in bringing about more awareness and more exposure